Hello, creators. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's live stream with Patreon's policy team. My name is Courtney. I am the head of creator policy engagement here at Patreon. And you may remember me if you tuned in for our first policy live Q&A back in April when I was just about a month into my time here. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by my policy colleague, Sean, who I'll introduce you to in a few minutes. This live stream is part of a series called Patreon Connect, designed to introduce you to some of the people that work here at Patreon, as well as the roles that we play here, and share some of our expertise to support you in building your creative business. This is the second live event in our Creator Policy Engagement Program, and we're excited to share that this is really just the beginning. We'll give creators just a minute or two to join us and settle in, and in the meantime, I'll walk us through a couple of housekeeping items to help us maximize the time we have together today. If you've joined us before, first of all, welcome back. You may notice we're using a new virtual events platform, which actually at the suggestion of a creator includes live closed captioning. You can just click on the CC button on the lower right corner of your screen and you'll be able to access that. On the right side of your screen, you'll see a chat window. And we'd love to see in the chat who's here today, where you're tuning in from. I saw we had a creator coming from France. I think it's going to be a global event. And also what it is that you create. Please feel free to engage in the chat throughout the presentation. And definitely keep an eye out in the chat for some of our Patreon colleagues who are supporting us behind the scenes today. So thank you to them. Now, for any questions that you've come with, or for any questions that come to mind during our presentation, let me draw your attention to the Q&A tab, which is where you can submit those, and you can also upvote any questions of other creators that you'd like to see answered. Sean and I will prioritize and address questions that are policy specific, as that's really our bread and butter in the area that we're best equipped to speak to. We'll get to just as many as we can, starting with those related to the policies that we'll discuss today. Finally, if you have to drop from the event early or you just like to watch it again, totally understand. We'll be emailing an on-demand version of the event to everyone who RSVP'd, so keep an eye out for that. And to be clear, the policy team will continue to hold live streams like this on a quarterly basis. So if we don't get to your question today, or if a brilliant question comes to mind after the fact, this will not be your only chance to ask us in a live setting like this. And there are other ways to reach us too, which we'll detail later on in the presentation. So without further ado, let's dive in so you can start to see the humans behind the scenes in Patreon's policy world. I'm joined today by my colleague, Sean, who's our content policy lead here at Patreon, who I will turn things over to say hello and share a little bit about himself.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay, Courtney?
Yes, I can.
Lovely, lovely. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Sean, and I've been with Patreon for about 3.5 years. I'm originally from LA, which is where I'm at right now. The room you see behind me is actually my nephew's room, which I annexed back in October. But under normal circumstances, I'd be up in San Francisco, which has been my permanent home for about 7 years. I moved up to SF to study journalism and then just stayed there after graduation. Before Patreon, I worked in trust and safety at YouTube doing copyright takedown responses. And before that, I did content programming for Bleacher Report's Team Stream app. So if anyone on the call is subscribed to any teams through Bleacher Report, I was on the team of people that was sending you push notifications, trying to shepherd you into the application. Together with Courtney and Laurent, our head of policy, who you may have met during our live event in April, we develop and iterate content policies to ensure Patreon community remains safe for patrons and creators alike. Those policies address subjects like hate speech, disinformation, adult content, bullying and harassment, doxing, and other themes and details we see with independent content creation. I've been helping Patreon address these issues and other content policy issues for over 3 years, first as a member of our trust and safety team, and now as the policy team content policy lead.
And your transition, Sean, to policy from trust and safety is, I think, really interesting and worth kind of contrasting the teams for folks and sharing how we work together, and we work together really closely. So folks can think of the policy team, which Sean and I are on, as a legislative body. So we make sure that the Patreon platform is as safe as possible by researching, debating, developing, and refining policies that are sort of the law of the land here, if you will, while the trust and safety team goes out and enforces those policies to ensure that platform safety. So, Sean, how does your background in trust and safety inform your current work on the policy side of the fence?
Yeah, when you work in trust and safety, you're constantly engaging with creators all day. You're just going having back and forth with creators. Creators on this call who may have interacted with trust and safety team will know this. It's a back and forth process through which you're trying to educate the creator around what's going on with their page. And being on that team gives you eyes and ears on the ground, and having that experience gives me what I feel to be important insights into sort of ways to improve our guidelines so they can better serve creators. Trust and safety clues us into trends they're seeing and help us understand if something we're working on is actually going to work for creators. They do a really good job of flagging policies that are confusing to creators and helping us develop clarifications. So having experience on both teams helps me, I feel, bridge that gap. Through this creator policy engagement program, I think the policy team is sort of trying to replicate that relationship it already shares with the trust and safety team and applying it to the policy team and creators.
Absolutely. And that's really where I come in. So, as head of creator policy engagement, I am the policy team's liaison to the creator community. So, Sean and I work really closely to develop and ultimately communicate Patreon's policies to all of you. So, a little bit about me: I'm a lifelong singer, and my career center of gravity has really focused where policy and tech and communications and the arts meets. So a role like this really is right up my alley, and I've been loving it so far. I'm a native New Englander, but I've lived on both coasts of the US. I weathered the majority of the pandemic up in Ontario, Canada, and I will eventually end up working out of Patreon's New York office. So if we haven't already met, I hope our paths will cross someday soon, whether virtually or in person. So that's the two of us in a nutshell. And now that you've met us, if you have any questions about our backgrounds, policy work, so on, you can drop those into that Q&A tab that I mentioned, which we'll tackle in a little bit. In the meantime, let's walk through how we will use our time together today. So we'll start things off with a recap of our Creator Policy Engagement Program, which we kicked off last quarter and are just thrilled to be continuing. We'll then move into an overview of a pair of policy updates that our team is proposing this quarter, as well as all the avenues that we've created for you to tell us what you think and how we can make the policies even better before they're finalized. Finally, as promised, we'll then move into our Q&A before wrapping up and saying goodbye for now. So, we talk a lot at Patreon about putting creators first. We talk about it constantly, and creator dialogue is really key in our ability to achieve that. So, in coming aboard at Patreon earlier this year, I learned pretty quickly that creators had been letting Patreon know for a while that policy development and communications left a little something to be desired. So together with Sean and the policy team, I dove into developing and launching a program to address this by engaging creators in our process, the aptly named Creator Policy Engagement Program, which we've taken to calling CPEP. So when it comes to Patreon policy, the most common things that creators have asked Patreon for were greater transparency, predictability, and inclusion in our policy process. That's more than fair. You deserve it. You deserve to be involved in what this process looks like. And so these were the themes that informed the creator first solutions that we designed for you. Here is what Patreon did to address these more than valid asks. So first, they created my role to have someone on board who thinks about this all day, every day. I came aboard in March, and this is truly my entire job, and I love it. So, Patreon's investment in the creation of my role is really just the tip of the iceberg in this realm. So, in the interest of transparency, predictability, and inclusion, we established that we'll propose policy updates on a predictable quarterly basis. And we've built out a range of feedback channels to meet creators wherever you're at. So we'll hold policy live streams like this one, but you can also sign up for individual office hours with me, smaller group roundtables, and we also have a team email address, to name a few, which dozens and dozens of you have already used, which is great. Creators have already really dug into these feedback channels, which has proved really valuable to me because I represent creators at the policy team table, and I work really hard to do that as authentically as possible. So formalizing these changes into what we now know as CPEP, we celebrated our launch back in April with a live Q&A, which I hosted along with our fearless leader, our head of policy, Laurent. Laurent and we shed light on the values that really drive our team's policy decisions. We detailed CPEP itself, and we shared 5 proposed policy updates that we sought your feedback on. Now, I really want to emphasize the shift that this marked. So rather than creating policy and dropping it on creators out of the blue, we were letting creators in on the policy updates that we were exploring and really analyzing and incorporating your feedback to improve our policy ideas before they ever get set in stone. And this was all part of our goal to help ensure that Patreon's policies are super clear, easy to understand, and of course, developed with transparency and inclusivity in mind. The policy updates we proposed last quarter ran the gamut from creators with criminal histories, teen creators, adult content creators, as well as some smaller scale policies concerning consumables, merchandise, trademark, and copyright. More than 300 creators, several of whom surely are joining us here today, contributed feedback that led to finalized policy that was so much stronger than the policy we initially proposed. And I'll let Sean share an example of how creator input improved our policy proposal around this first one, creators who have served time for past criminal convictions.
Yeah, we knew we needed to update the section of our guidelines called Who Can't Use Patreon. Up through 2020, our guidelines language had stated broadly that creators with criminal histories could not use Patreon to fund their projects. And we originally wrote this policy to help prevent extremist actors like people on terrorist lists from earning money through Patreon. However, as a team, we recognize this broad language inadvertently also applied to people who may have been arrested in the past, but who did their time and fulfilled the terms of their sentence. They should be allowed to create on Patreon. So in April, we proposed a policy update clarifying that if you had a criminal record, but you served your time, you can create on the platform. In the version of the policy that we initially proposed to creators, we included a caveat that these creators couldn't create campaigns around what they'd been arrested for. And our thinking here was that if someone had been arrested in the past for something like burglary, we didn't want them creating content that would show others how to pick locks and stuff like that. So when we asked for creator feedback on this, creators pointed out there was room to make this policy update more inclusive. For some creators whose criminal records concerned addiction, violence, or the general criminal justice system, their content may focus on educational and community outcomes like recovery ideals and practices. This is technically content focused on what they were arrested for, but it has a good influence on patrons and should be admissible on the platform.
Yes, it's really, really important to us that they, like all Patreon creators, feel welcome. And the finalized policy was really made stronger thanks to that creator feedback. So as you can see, these creator comments shared across our new feedback channels, creators found value in us pulling back the policy curtain and have expressed, cautious optimism about its future prospects. We are really optimistic too, and we want to build upon last quarter's CPEP momentum. So, sure enough, a few months flew by, and the time is now upon us to share the next installment of our quarterly CPEP policy proposals. We have 2 proposed policy updates this time and are eager to hear your thoughts. The first of which focuses on financial advice. You may recall reading recently about GameStop, Bitcoin, and other kind of hot topics in the news. And sure enough, since early 2021, we've seen a growing community on Patreon focused on finance and specifically financial advice. Certain regions have existing consumer protection laws requiring financial advisors be certified. So the updates that we're exploring here would A, just note our compliance with those laws, and B, encourage patrons to consult financial advisors familiar with their individual financial circumstances before they make any investment decisions. So we're eager to hear from you on that. And the other proposed policy update focuses on chargebacks. Chargebacks are initiated when individuals, or in Patreon's case, patrons, reach out to their financial institution to dispute a transaction and basically request for their money to be returned. These chargebacks, when done for fraudulent purposes, really harm creators and Patreon alike. So to protect creators from fraud, this proposed policy update would state that patrons who file excessive fraudulent chargebacks may be suspended from supporting new creators or accessing Patreon altogether. So, those are the 2 policy topics this quarter's proposals focus on: financial advice and chargebacks. And in the meantime, we'll turn now to the Q&A portion of our event. So there's still time to submit questions in that Q&A tab, and you can upvote questions others have submitted that resonate with you. Sean and I will get to as many as we can. And if there's a question that we don't have an answer to, we'll be honest with you about that. I think that's the least we can do. So as I mentioned earlier, we will prioritize questions focused on policy, including the proposals around financial advice and chargebacks I just outlined, along with the Creator Policy Engagement Program broadly. Several creators submitted questions in advance too. You may recall doing so when you RSVP'd or through one of our feedback channels. So while things develop over in that Q&A tab, Sean and I will get started in answering some of the great questions that were submitted recently. So this first question came to our team's email alias, which I'll plug, creatorpolicy@patreon.com. You can email us anytime. This creator's question concerned the chargeback policy. I've never seen a chargeback as far as I know. Why should creators even care about this? Great question. So sometimes patrons file chargebacks for totally legitimate reasons, and that is not what this policy would seek to address. So this policy is meant for instances in which Patreon's fraud team detects patrons filing a high volume of chargebacks, a ton of chargebacks, which is typically intended to defraud Patreon creators. We, of course, don't want that. That's the last thing we want, just as creators don't want that either. So to your question as to why you should care about this, the real takeaway is that this policy update would help us support you against any kind of ill-intentioned uses of chargebacks like the ones I described.
Yeah, and up until now, we had not formalized this support for our creators in our guidelines. There's nothing user-facing around it. which would allow us to weed out abusive patrons who don't have any interest in actually paying for Patreon funded content at the end of the day. And that's, I think, best exemplified by their excessive use of chargebacks.
Exactly. All right, our next question came from a creator in our community Discord. I read some recent Patreon policy stuff regarding COVID-19. I'm wondering and hoping that Patreon is going to put a similar policy in place regarding climate change. Okay, great question. So for some context here, this creator is referencing a blog post we published back in February around steps that we take to prevent misinformation related to COVID-19 prevention, mitigation, and treatment from spreading on our platform. Another framing of this question, I think, is basically how does Patreon determine which types of disinformation to ban from the Patreon platform? You know, we elected to do this with COVID-19 misinformation. So what about other types of misinformation? Which is an important topic. So stepping back, with any policy like this that we consider proposing, we're really mindful that we're balancing dual responsibilities. So first, we take really, really seriously our responsibility to keep the platform and those who use it safe, just sort of straight up, right? And we also take really seriously our responsibility to protect the free speech of those who use the platform.
Yeah, and I like to think of the example of someone yelling fire in a crowded theater. That's not justifiable free speech, as it could lead to people getting physically hurt. And on our platform, when these lines between speech and safety get blurred, we have applied a similar methodology. When certain speech, like misinformation, demonstrates an immediate capacity to hurt people, we craft policies to address it. It's our commitment to safety that motivates our doing that. What informed our decision on COVID medical misinformation was that its presence on the platform could lead to people in the near term getting sick and potentially dying. So whether we're evaluating myths and disinformation related to climate change, COVID, and everything in between, that's the framework we're sort of applying and using. And down the line, as we consider what types of misinformation to potentially disallow with a policy, we will be considering those dynamics, protecting our users' freedom of speech and prioritizing safety on the platform.
Absolutely. And we really are very eager to hear from you about other types of misinformation that we should consider through that lens. So please keep adding your questions in that Q&A tab. I see some of you have done so already, which is great. In the meantime, we have a question that arose in our last policy Q&A and also in an office hour session that a creator booked with me. Any updates on NFTs? So this topic came up in that April live stream, and there's no kind of major update here, but did want to address it. So really any time that we identify a new technology that's empowering creators to innovate, we do our due diligence to explore the ins and outs and, determine how we can best accommodate it on Patreon. And so while we haven't finalized any guidelines, updates, or decisions around NFTs, we have gotten a lot of feedback over the past few months in this regard, which is great. And we're taking all of that input into account. So we will plan to share any updates, of course, that are finalized in the space with creators in a future policy live stream. All right. So this question, which came to us through Discord, addresses adult content, which we know is a popular topic. Where is the pressure to censor 18 plus creators coming from? Is it internal staff, venture capital owners, financial partner companies, lobbyists? Okay. There are a number of different factors that Patreon considers in regards to its 18 plus content guidelines. And while we always strive to be creator first with our content guidelines, we also have to consider the policies on these issues of our payment processing partners, who are, of course, crucial partners in getting creators paid, which is, of course, our mission. Our mission is to fund the creative class. So I want to zoom out a little bit too to shed light on this from the industry level. So, relating to the entire financial services sector and the whole internet ecosystem that we are, of course, a part of. This year, we've seen payment processing networks like MasterCard moving towards establishing new policies related to adult content that we and every other major platform must comply with, or else our creators won't get paid at all. So over the next few months, we're going to provide more insights into how those rule changes will affect the internet stakeholders at large. And just for context, when powerful players in the financial services industry are setting new rules about how platforms can host and distribute and process money related to 18 plus content, those of us within that ecosystem, and there's a lot of us, as I'm sure you've gathered, we're not the only ones grappling with this, certainly, have to try to suss out what those boundaries even are and how we can comply with them while trying to minimize as many obstacles to creators that we possibly can.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note, Courtney, that heading into the last quarter, we saw that our 18 plus policies needed more clarity and in certain cases were more restricted than some other platforms like operating in the same space that Patreon does. So for example, many social media platforms were allowing an image of someone's unclothed back to be seen by all audiences, which at the time Patreon would have classified as 18 plus content needing to be reserved for patron only posts. We recognized there was a little room to dance here, so we proposed an 18 plus policy update last quarter that we got feedback on, which sought to help creators better understand how we distinguish 18 plus content from all audience content. And we heard from like dozens of creators who, under the new clarified guidelines, have since been able to drop the 18 plus label and reach all audiences. Other creators can now feature certain mature content on the public facing parts of their pages that previously they had to keep behind the paywall for patrons only.
Yes. We know that this feels like small potatoes in the grand scheme and acknowledge that this stuff is really hard. I would say a key takeaway from each of our Policy Live events, where there have been so many 18 plus related questions, is that there's an opportunity to offer programming specifically for Patreon's adult content creators. So we are glad to share that we're hosting a live stream next month, which will focus on policies related to 18 plus content specifically. We know one event won't solve everything, but we really see it as a first step in these kind of ongoing conversations to help us do a better job of sharing where we're at with all of this and connecting with you all about it. And so I just ask that you stay tuned for additional details on that, but certainly we hope to see many of you there. All right. So let's turn now to the questions submitted in our Q&A tab. All right. Well, we'll start with an easy one off the bat from Ariella. Ariella asks, what is your team email address? So Ariella, we'll have this on a slide once the Q&A is over, but our team email address is creatorpolicy@patreon.com. Okay. Question from, from Dr. Wendy Walsh. What are your limits on adult content? How do you keep Patreon from becoming an OnlyFans? Okay, so we addressed the 18 plus topic a little bit, and as I said, we'll have another live stream about this next month. But Sean, I wonder if you could give sort of an overview here on the limits, the scope of our adult content policy.
Yeah, and I think I should start by saying we aren't necessarily like motivated by avoiding becoming OnlyFans. We're guided, by other means. In terms of limits, in the live content space, adult content featuring real people, any content featuring sexual activity between individuals or an individual with themselves can't be funded or shared through Patreon. And on the animated side, basically any what we call fringe content, which is stuff that features. This is for both the animated and the live action side. Anything that features things like incest, glorification of sexual violence, or bestiality that can't be funded through the platform. Um, let me take a look at the question and see if that's a thorough response. How do we keep Patreon becoming an OnlyFans? Yeah, I think that's kind of like the purest distillation of it. I don't know. What do you think? Can I say anything further, Courtney? You think would be
Yeah,
helpful?
I think that's a good summary. Again, people can tune in next month. Also, if there are any kind of clarifying questions folks have, you can ask those in the Q&A tab as well. So we have a question for the chargeback, for the proposed policy on chargebacks. You mentioned excessive use of chargebacks. Will that be defined or case by case adjudicated? Yes, so that will be on a case by case basis. It just sort of does vary based on the circumstances there. That's a great question. Let's see. Okay, so Soul Dancer asks, regarding financial advisors, a similar concern relates to well-being services, health, emotional, etc. Okay, yes. So I think what this question is getting at is the fact that kind of crux of our financial advice policy relates to some of these existing local kind of consumer protection regulations that our update would just say that we would comply with. So I think Soul Dancer is saying, there are existing consumer protection laws related to health and wellness and, mental health and that sort of thing, which is a great point. So I think Soul Dancer is asking whether that we would have policy on that as well. We do not currently have policy in that regard, but I think it's a great point to bring up. We really appreciate your feedback on that if you have additional resources that you'd like to share. But no other update on that as far as I know. Anything from you, Sean?
I would answer this two ways, I think. First, by like characterizing what we're trying to balance, particularly with the financial advice policy. We're trying to simultaneously respect the autonomy of the consumer, like their ability to do what they will with their dollar, whilst also not subjecting people or helping people bankroll fraudulent or demonstrably harmful projects. And I think it's kind of the same principle with the question, um, where perhaps you have someone who's posturing as a professional in a certain space, but they don't have the accreditation or the credentials that actually demonstrate that professional sort of pedigree. But like I think the other thing here is to note is like we also want to participate in the disruption of certain institutions, where people can be independent content creators and also not subject their audience to either inadvertent or deliberate harm. So there are a few things we're balancing when developing these policies. If that creator who noted that has any resources or NGOs that we should take into mind whilst like considering those, um, I'd be all ears to looking at any literature they have. And I think there's actually probably like a good like use case in the past when I was on the trust and safety team, which was we had a creator who they were going all the way with it and saying that they had accreditation from an institution in Ontario that they didn't actually have. And the way we found out was the institution reached out to us and said, hey, we've had this person online posturing as a graduate from our institution, and they are not one. Could you please either remove their page or have them cease, like presenting that accreditation in their campaign. And at that point, we were just like, well, if this person's going to like lie about, somewhere that they've gone to school to convince their audience of something, we don't want to just have them remove that and then move on to another institution or something. So we ended up just removing that campaign.
Great. So thank you for clarifying that, Sean. Let's see. Steve asks about financial advice. For the financial advice update, I think. Is this just a statement saying Patreon does not support versus taking action? So I think, so Steve, to kind of give you a sense for this, we're basically saying, we're acknowledging that there are some local regulations in this regard, and we will sort of honor that. And we will also add to our community guidelines. There's a section that's specifically kind of written for patrons. So we're just advising patrons, to consult with a financial advisor who's familiar with their own individual financial circumstances before they make any investments on the basis of advice that they encounter on Patreon. So, that's not something that is enforceable on our end. We just want to kind of do right by folks who use our platform and make sure that that's flagged to them as something that is an option for them as well. Let's see. Simone asks, Sean, I think this is a question for you. Given how many people compare furry art with bestiality, especially if it is furry characters with humans, even when not engaged in sexual activity, how do you intend to protect people addressing that kind of art?
Yeah, furry art is actually a space that we get very detail oriented in the way we review it, because Simone's right, it's not a one for one for bestiality. And I think we actually have a pretty healthy both live action and animated furry art community that we're very proud of to host. So let me get down to the question part. How do you intend to protect people addressing that kind of art? I think by maintaining that, that lack of alignment between bestiality and furry art, knowing that they are actually two completely separate institutions, one of which we fully support and want to continue to support, and the other is one that we've never been okay with supporting. So Simone, that's a great call out. If there's an example where you in particular had something that has sort of deviated from anything that I just said, I very much want to know about it. Because that's probably opportunity to clarify either with you, the creator, or internally at Patreon. If there's any misalignment there, we don't want it to exist beyond this call.
Absolutely. Okay. So you've got a bunch of 18 plus questions, which I do, want to acknowledge and answer. I want to also be mindful that there may be other questions as well. But let's take one. Let's see. Okay, Violet asks, where is the line to be drawn for illustrative, not safe for work content creators and creative freedom and these adult content limitations?
So if we're asking about illustrations, is that what look back in the chat, I think Violet actually described pretty well there. The content they're funding. But Violet, if I'm clear, you create animated adult art through Patreon. Is that correct? Just give me a yes or a no in the chat. Cool. So where are the limits? The limits are in any of that anything that falls under that broad umbrella of fringe art. So if there's glorification of sexualized violence, any dubious consent or coerced consent in the art, then it's going to be a violation of that fringe content guidelines. But blanket, like sexual interaction between characters, sexual narrative between characters, evocative artwork, that's stuff that we support. The lone barrier there being, because Patreon has users as young as 13, we do ask that if any of that artwork is going to be featuring on the website, that you do reserve it for patron-only posts, so that young users don't happen upon it. There are other stops in place, like people may know if your page is flagged as 18 plus, you are omitted from the few discovery portions that we do have as part of the platform and from the search. But outside of that, your fee is the same and all of the features of the website are the same to you. Then what is the point of the 18 plus content warning? We can set our page to, it's to limit, plainly it's to limit the those underage users from happening upon your content inadvertently or deliberately. I mean, keeping it real, when I was 14, I wasn't necessarily safeguarding myself when operating on like rotten.com or whatever it was I was looking at the time. But that's the main point. Also, like with our payment processors, they've asked that we limit access to that content as part of our agreement with them. So it's kind of twofold. I hope that's an answer, Violet. Please let me know if it's not.
Yeah, Violet, do let us know if you have other questions in that regard. Sean mentioned teens on Patreon. Yes, there are teens who are users on Patreon. There are also teens who are creators on Patreon. And last quarter, that was one of the policy updates that we proposed with our CPEP kickoff. We really wanted to protect teen creators from, instances of solicitation or attempts to groom them, that sort of thing that is just unfortunately a reality on platforms in just the general kind of internet ecosystem. And so creator feedback really helped us finalize policy in that regard. And it's part of this ongoing process that we have to protect those who are on our platform, our teen creators certainly, but all creators as well. Let's see.
Courtney, really quick, there was just something I saw in the chat that I want to address. I see that Tammy Jo is saying that they have to leave pretty soon. And just really quickly, Tammy Jo, that what you're talking about sounds like a wayward application of that feature. Like that's not the kind of content that we're targeting with that. So if you could please write in to support@patreon.com with a screenshot of the notification and the corresponding post, that'll help our engineering teams kind of retrain that so that it doesn't, invite like wayward applications as it did in your instance. That's very unfortunate, and that's not what that is designed to do. So thanks for flagging that.
Yes. Nikita, thank you for your kind words. Yes, we really want to just be as open and honest as we can about the not safe for work topic. Glad to hear you're an artist as well, and I hope you can join us next month for the next policy live stream for our Q4. Let's see. Okay, Tammy Jo asks, there seems to be trigger words that cause a pop-up rarely to happen when I'm about to post. Can you list the trigger words, please, in a document?
Oof. So it's there's I don't know if it's so simple that it's a bunch of words. I think it's more vision or image and text classifiers. The reason, and I would say, like, even if we did have like a catalog, the reason we wouldn't want to publish it is because that kind of gives a sort of like a blueprint to circumvention of those guidelines that are being assessed there, sort of plainly. I think of like the phenomenon on Twitter a few years ago, and it's kind of become like a sort of a controlled joke on Twitter, but the triple parentheses around anti-Semitic statements to kind of make them kind of like a wink or a nod, and to make them more difficult to search for through Twitter's search function. People found that they could game the search by making their rhetoric a little bit more difficult to find. And we want to avoid that happening on Patreon. So that's why I don't think we would ever actually publish the work. That doesn't mean we don't want to make that process better, and mitigate opportunities or instances where Tammy Jo's pretty unfortunate happening took place. So again, Tammy Jo, please just send us a link to that post, and that'll help us train the models that are applying that to get a little bit better at recognizing when it should and should not be applied.
Yes, absolutely. Question here from Mohammed. In Patreon policy, from which age onwards can we be a Patreon creator? So from age 13 onwards, so that when we talk about the teen creators who last quarter's policy update, sought to protect, that's who we're talking about. So folks 13 to 17, right up 18, 19, and so on. That is kind of the age range there. I hope that answers your question. Okay, Mariana asks, for creators that live outside of the US, I'm from Peru, for example, how would these policies affect us? This is a great question. In general, Patreon's approach has been to have our community guidelines apply for creators and patrons all around the world. We don't want it to be a case where we have a certain set of community guidelines for one nation or one continent specifically. We really design our policies with, the globalization that Patreon is doing in mind, and we're really mindful of that. And we love that creators from all over the world are coming aboard the platform and sharing their work. So yes, these policies would affect creators in Peru as they would affect creators all over the world. As with the financial advice update proposal that we shared, in rare instances, there are some kind of localized caveats or sort of quirks that our policies might address or we might seek to address. But in general, Mariana, you can safely say that the community guidelines will impact you as they would creators all over the world. So thank you for your question there. Let's see. Tanner asks about audio. So Sean, this would be a question for you. Is audio considered live action?
Typically, no. Like ASMR content, we will typically view as in a similar light as we would animated content, as though it's simulated or not actually live action. If there's a more detailed question, Tanner, or if there's a specific type of content that you would want a more straightforward answer for, please let us know. But the general rule is no. Different audio only is treated differently compared to audio visual. I've actually considered pitching a blog post to kind of delineate those two. It would probably be a ways away, but yeah, that's a good question. Let me know if that's helpful.
Yes. We have a follow-up too from Mohammed to Mariana's previous question about Mariana's based in Peru. So Mohammed asks if there are any changes in India. So the answer to that is no. I would mirror what I said to Mariana. No kind of India-specific policy updates at this time. Let's see. Okay. Stanley asks, if someone has a copyright registered with LOC, but someone claims ownership, how would that be handled by Patreon? Sean?
So in this instance, we are getting an inbound DMCA takedown request, and it's a sound request, and there is third-party ownership of the IP in question. Is that
That's
kind of the gist?
That's how I read it. Although Stanley,
Okay.
feel free to clarify
Okay.
if we're misinterpreting your question.
The way I'm not a copyright specialist, we do actually have one, and it would be great if that person were here to answer this more thoroughly. But the way I would see that playing out, Stanley, is we would receive an inbound DMCA and assess that it's not a fair use instance that we want to acquiesce the DMCA, and that could initiate from the targeted policies perspective the opportunity to produce a counter DMCA notice, in which case they could produce any documentation that demonstrates their rights to use the IP in question. And this third-party ownership would imagine come with documentation that would satisfy that. In which case we would allow the content to to continue to live on. I believe that's how it would work. I should also say, the way we currently process DMCAs to remain in in compliance and to maintain our safe harbor. We do actually initially give creators the opportunity to self-moderate. We don't strike down the content on, in the first 24 hours. Um, and it's not often enough, but sometimes that produces the opportunity for some sort of personal agreement between the two parties, the DMCA requester and the targeted party. I hope
Yes.
that's a response, Stanley. Is there anything else you want to say on the matter?
Yeah. So to clarify, so I know, so by LOC, I realized we didn't clarify this. So Stanley's referring to the Library of Congress,
Yep.
which is really the arbiter on copyright. So yeah, I think if a work is, registered with the Library of Congress, it should be registered with the Library of Congress to, have its copyright identified. So we would, in that case, I think have to go with that designation as opposed to someone else's claim because the LOC is the arbiter on copyright. But yeah, just to be totally clear, Sean and I were not experts on this, so I don't want to lead you astray. That's, I think, the information we can give you at this point. But Stanley would encourage you to reach out to us with any kind of more specific question in that regard. So creatorpolicy@patreon.com. We can point you in the right direction if Sean and I, if there were any kind of loose ends to your question that we didn't get to. But I hope we did. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left.
Oh wow, that flew by. I
Oh,
didn't
Stanley
realize it
did
was
clarify.
10:52.
Stanley did clarify. So let's say content from my old employer, although I have the actually registered copyright. Okay. Yeah, Stanley, if you don't mind emailing us, I want to give you a response that's, kind of personal to you without, leading anyone astray in that regard. So thank you for that question. Sophie asks, is nudity considered 18 plus? I mean, nude drawing. So drawings of nudity.
Yeah, so broadly, no, not necessarily. There's a ton of nudity that we do not consider 18 plus, that plainly society would not consider 18 plus. If there's no solicited sexual gaze, or if it's just a perfect example is breastfeeding support content that is not, I wouldn't say popular on Patreon, but it's very helpful to new mothers to to sort of interact and consume those creators' content. That's an example of nudity that wouldn't be 18 plus. Everyone's favorite example is the statue of David in Florence. That's an example of non-18 plus nudity. So Sophie, no, generally speaking, that's as you stated. It's not broadly considered 18 plus if there's nudity, drawing or live action.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Let's see. Mariana asks, maybe this will be our last question. Is there an audio consideration for music with copyright as a background for a video on our Patreon communities?
So is that like an instance where they're hosting like a live interaction with patrons and there's music in the background?
That may be the case, whether if it's some sort of live video footage, or Mariana may be referencing just the background of a video that is kind of pre-created.
Um, I'm not 100% sure about audio consideration. I think there are definitely cases where use of music in a video can like safely and accurately be targeted by DMCA takedowns. That's definitely something that needs to be considered. Um, but I'm not sure how to answer it beyond
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Please feel free to reach out to us, Mariana, and we can get you a more kind of well-rounded answer on that. We just don't want to say anything that's inaccurate. We want to make sure we're giving you kind of the way things are in that. So with that, I think we will wrap things up. I do just want to highlight some of the ways that we can hear from creators to help us refine our policy updates before they're finalized and implemented in the next couple of weeks. So, a couple big things you can do. You will all be receiving an email later today. We encourage you to fill out a survey that we've created where you can give feedback on this event itself. Please feel free to share updates on or your thoughts on these specific policy proposals, the CPEP program at large, and feel free to throw in any types of live stream topics that you'd like to see us address in the future. You can do the same if you email a creatorpolicy@patreon.com, which we've mentioned a couple of times today. You can sign up for office hours with me if you would prefer a one-on-one setting. I totally understand and really love having a chance to get to meet creators individually. And finally, over the next 24 hours, Sean and I will be joined by our colleague Laurent, our head of policy, in a Discord channel. So the channel is policy-live-Q3-2021, where we'll tackle, any lingering questions that you may have from this presentation or any thoughts and feedback that you have on these proposals. So we'll do that for the next 24 hours. So please feel free to pop by there. With that, really want to thank you all for coming and being so engaged with these questions and these thoughts. Sean, thank you for joining me. I hope everyone appreciated the chance to get to meet you. Would also like to thank our community team, especially Emily and Haley, who have been so instrumental in helping us bring this content to you all. And with that, I really look forward to engaging you all on policy down the line and hope to see many of you in our Q4 live stream coming up in September. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.